So next we want to talk a little bit about psychological hungers. One of the things Byrne was curious about is why people bother to transact with one another in the first place. And he realized that just as we have certain physiological hungers like food, water, sex, other things, we also have certain psychological hungers that motivate a tremendous amount of our behavior. I want to just list these for you, and then we are going to be going into depth about each one. The first hunger, psychological hunger that he identified was what he calls stimulus hunger, which gets sublimated into recognition hunger. And he used the term stroke hunger to categorize both of those. If you think about a little kid who's being fed and nursing at mother's breast, the whole GI tract is getting stimulated in that process. Mother often is stroking the child's body, playing with the child's hands, fingers, toes, hair, so forth. So there's almost total stimulation of that child as the child nurses. Once the child becomes a toddler and begins to crawl down off of mother's lap and explore the world beyond mother, a kind look or a kind gesture or word feels almost as good as that stimulation, but not quite. We never totally outgrow our need for physical stimulation. And as adults, we tend to seek out both physical stimulation as well as recognition. And as I mentioned earlier, Byrne talked about the importance of stroking in order to complete the nervous system. He liked to say we need lots of strokes each day to keep our backbones from shriveling up. So he really emphasized the importance of getting stimulation, and we get all kinds of messages against that in our society, and that we often go around stroke deprived as a result. Felipe is going to talk more about that a little later. A second type of structure he identified is what he calls structure hunger, which has as a corollary leadership hunger. We usually feel a need to structure time in some meaningful way in order to have a sense of purpose and meaning to our lives. And we often elect leaders to provide structure for us in society and in organizations and groups. A third type of hunger that actually was identified by Claude Steiner is what Steiner called position hunger, one of the basic existential positions. Once we decide on a certain existential position in childhood, we often have a hunger to maintain that position in order to keep the world predictable. And so we will often operate in ways to try to justify that I'm okay and you're okay, or I'm okay, you're not, or I'm not and you are, or neither of us are okay, depending on what is most psychologically familiar and comfortable to us. So Felipe is going to talk a little more about stroke hunger, and then I'll later talk about structure hunger.
Stroke hunger and strokes is the currency of transactions, and it's really the currency of our lives. And it's very interesting to see, because of all of the restrictions that people have, like men are not supposed to need strokes. I don't need any of that. I'm strong enough on my own. But that's cultural truth. It's not true. You still need them. And so all of the kinds of ways that we go about getting them is what we're going to be talking about. But strokes is the currency in transactions. And that's why it's called transactional analysis, because of the stroke there. And which reminds me of your question. You asked a question about the psychological level of transaction, right?
Yeah.
Will you ask it again?
Sure.
Because it applies to strokes.
The question I asked before was, is it possible that the ulterior transaction then the hooking that happens could happen unintentionally? like someone says something where they're genuinely acting themselves from a, adult state, and then I take it a totally different way.
And it's very important that ulterior transactions are out of conscious awareness. If it's conscious awareness, it's not an ulterior transaction, it's a maneuver. And the reason that I wanted to bring that topic into this topic is because the way we do ulterior ways of getting transactions that are not straight ways and not very effective. Because if we don't even own our need for transactions and we're doing these crooked ways of getting getting strokes, we don't even receive them because we don't even know that that's what's happening in the process. So we need to give ourselves permission to understand that strokes are very important for our needs. There are several types of strokes that we can talk about. There's unconditional and conditional, positive and negative, verbal, nonverbal, and physical strokes. And we need them all, and they come in different degrees of comfort and permission to receive them. So we'll look at examples of all four of those. Unconditional positive strokes is what reinforces I'm an I'm okay, you're okay place. It's about essence, it's about being. Unconditional stroke is, I was flying here on Delta yesterday, and I put their napkin in my pocket because it said, when you're in the world is a better place. I think it said something about, it implied that when you're in the world, in terms of if you fly with them. But it was an attempt at an unconditional positive stroke. I thought, well, thank you. But unconditional positive strokes are very important to understand essence and being. I have a client who does not understand unconditional positive strokes. He believes that once you grow up to be a grown man, there is no such thing, that there's always conditions. Unconditional positive, I love you, you matter, you're okay. To myself, I say I'm okay, I like myself. One of the most important ways that I think we can give each other positive unconditional strokes is listening and mirroring. I think both of those are examples of giving you matter, and therefore I'm going to listen. And if I choose, and if for some reason or another, the conditional level, what you're saying is not helpful or useful, and I stop that, that's at the conditional level. So conditional positive, negative strokes are behavior that you're displaying that is not okay. But we must learn how to give negative conditional strokes while maintaining the okay place. And so finding ways that we can do that in a careful way that we can continue to reinforce the okay place. Positive conditional strokes is about doing or having. And they're wonderful to receive, but they will not make up for the unconditional positive need. So people like Marilyn Monroe or famous actors like Elvis Presley, they accomplish a lot, and I think there are other people we could mention that are unmentionable right now, who it doesn't matter how much you accomplish, you're still not feeling okay about yourself. You can never gain a sense of okayness at the unconditional level by conditional positive strokes. And you can wear yourself out trying, but it's not going to work. There has to be a shift at the unconditional level about, I'm okay, I have essence just as important as the Queen of England or anybody else. I'm okay and you're okay because we are living beings. No matter what color you are, what gender you are, what sexual preference you are, I am okay and you are too. That's why that's so important. Unconditional negative strokes are about racism, sexism, exclusion, inequality. And their unconditional negative strokes are to be avoided and not used and confronted when they are being used. And I think that was the example that you were giving earlier. Unconditional negative strokes are not okay. And if they're, which brings me to bullying and teasing, because I think it borders on unconditional negative strokes. And I think we should avoid them, and we should confront them when we hear them in any form. Okay, there's some cultural rules that Claude Steiner identified that impact our permission to receive and exchange strokes. And they are don't stroke, don't ask for strokes. I thought, don't ask for strokes because people are going to think you're needy or you're weak, so don't ask. Don't give strokes because you're polishing the apple or whatever it's like. What are you trying to get by giving strokes? Don't give yourself strokes because people are going to think you're big-headed or self-centered. Don't accept strokes because the same reason you're going to get big-headed. And those are rules that we heard as we were growing up, both being given to children and to ourselves. And don't reject strokes.
I was just wondering if it's universal or if you change the cultural rules depending on what culture you're speaking about. Is it a
Thank you
specific
very
culture?
much for bringing that up. It's very different in different cultures. These rules are mostly about the U.S. Like for instance, when we were talking about the Japanese culture, I worked in Japan for a while, and it reminded me of the Spanish-Mexican culture, that strokes, individual personal strokes, are harder to come about because it's supposed to be the family that we come from that is supposed to be strokes. So yes, cultural implications will vary on those rules. Thank you very much. But there is similarities, and it's good to explore which ones are the limitations in which culture that we're working in or we come from in order to change them. Okay? So the permissions to each of these strokes, instead of not asking for strokes, is to ask for strokes. I thought of asking for strokes today because I wanted some water, and I was going to go to the bar to ask for a glass of water because I needed to take a pill. And I came by the counter, and the lady said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I'm looking for some water. I'd like to get some water." And she said, "Oh, here's," and she gave me a bottle of water, and I thought, it's good to ask for strokes. Give strokes. Now, what kind of strokes do we want to give and ask for? Listen, help. Will you help me with this? Feedback. Will you give me some feedback? Because when we think about these rules, we think about bragging or just positive strokes or verbal strokes, but they could be physical. Give me a back rub. Will you hold me for a minute? Will you let me just lean on you for a minute? There are all kinds of ways that we can get strokes that we don't think about in terms of expanding our economy of strokes. Reject strokes. Very often I'll say something like, "That wasn't very helpful," particularly when rescuers are around. I appreciate it, but that wasn't helpful. And give yourself stroke. Often we think about giving yourself strokes in terms of bragging, which is not bad. But you can celebrate your wins, and you might set it up by saying, "I'd like to share some wins that I had or some successes that I had that I'm real proud of. Would you like to hear?" There's a contract. As often as we set up a contract, the better, because we're engaging the other person to be with us in the process. But we can stroke ourselves internally. I'm real proud of myself for that, or I feel so good about that. And in terms of that internal dialogue, is pay attention to what you say to yourself, because the most important that we are learning how to stroke ourselves internally and give ourselves a break and listen to what we say to ourselves. Accepting strokes, that's a big one. Accepting strokes is letting them come in. Val just confronted me on one that I got, and I changed the subject, which is so common, and she said, "Will you accept a stroke?" Ways to accept strokes that I found useful is, "Will you say that again?" I'm learning how to take those things in. I want to take a moment to breathe that in and hear it and accept it and take it in, because our internal dialogue, negative internal dialogue, is often so strong. We have to work on this all the time. As I was thinking about, there's experienced people in in the TA theory that have been learning this forever, and there's new people here today. And for starting new, or whether I've done this forever and ever, we can always continue to learn, because it's a changing process, and the theory is just a tool for us to see what's happening and what we're doing and how we can use it to change ourselves and our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with others. So did I cover it enough? Yeah, taking it in, I want to hear that. And I'm just so aware myself of what a challenge that is, how easy it is to not take it in. But remember, the goal is to be okay, to keep building my sense of value and yours too. So there was another question.
Yeah, I was wondering if self-strokes, if the stimulus matters. Like I'm thinking about a reaction to anxiety and trying to talk yourself down, like I'm okay, everything is fine, and like the stimulus there is different rather than like baseline life. I might not talk to myself that way, if that makes sense. So is that
That's
still
a
in
very
the strokes
useful,
economy?
if I hear you correctly, that's a very useful way of stroking yourself, is to calm yourself down, because a child is scared and nervous and anxious. And so for us to develop a part that take a breath, you're okay. Yeah, that's a very useful way of doing self-stroking, for sure. Yeah. Okay, down at the bottom of that slide, you get what you stroke. In classrooms and very often in parenting, parents or teachers will only pay attention to the student when they're misbehaving. Stop that. And if they're not misbehaving, they ignore them. In some families, parents only pay attention to children, or they really pay attention to children when they get sick. And so they learn how to be sick to get attention. And so you get what you stroke. So it's important to stroke what you like. I hope that one's the next. Yeah, stroke what you want. The more you stroke what you want, the more you're going to get it. Negative strokes fulfill the need for strokes like positive strokes. Right. And so some people just set themselves up for negative strokes because that's what they learn to get. And so it's important to know that, and that's how come stroke what you want is important.
Is the lack of strokes
Yes.
in America, is it particularly acute in American culture because of our rugged individualism and, this myth that you do things for yourself?
Yes. Yeah, I shouldn't need them. We don't need them. I'm strong. I'm a big boy now. You're a big boy now. We get all those kinds of messages. Absolutely, for sure, yeah. So I have two other types of strokes that I wanted to talk about, and that is target strokes, and that is, what is it that feels the best to you? What is it that you like to hear? In doing couples work, I often ask that of a couple, what would you like to hear from your mate? And that's a target stroke that I feel the best, and it's usually the one that's given the least. And couples have a way of finding each other so that they'll reinforce what parents used to do. And so parents who didn't know how to give the positive stroke that the child needed often marry somebody who doesn't know how to give that stroke either. Right? Isn't that amazing? Yeah. We have a tendency to pick our mates that reflect the way that our parents stroked us. And we need to pay attention to that when we're dating. The target discount is that the way that couples hurt each other, not only couples, but bosses and employees in interactions, it's usually the one that hurt the most as a child. It's reinforcing that early negative place that is the most hurtful. And so one of the things that I did always, and I say did because I don't see couples anymore. It's hard work. Is to help them identify their target stroke and target discount, what they wanted to hear the most and what was the most hurtful. And they usually come into counseling because they are exchanging the most hurtful strokes, which is a target discount. Any questions?
I think about strokes in terms of units of recognition, and I'm always really thinking a lot about how it is we're raising boys or male-identified people in our society, and I think about the way you've brought up how we are not necessarily always letting boys and men access emotion, and that's like a real discount, and it's a real negative stroke in a sense. And at the same time, what I think men also get in terms of positive strokes is their ability to see themselves in positions of power, leadership, right? And it creates a sense of almost entitlement, like that's the path I'm going to go down, and that's my destiny to see, you know, all of my presidents be white males, all of the movie stars that I see, you know, reflect who I am. So that idea of like visibility is a stroke, right?
That there's a way in which we reinforce the not needing strokes by our attributions in child rearing males or in relating to males or stroking males.
Felipe, I'm thinking about also that it's the point about men, the male identified reality you're describing actually is reinforcing strokes for doing. And so underneath is the fragility because the being is emotional and it's not getting addressed. You see? So it's even more painful. I mean, more of I think a cost of male privilege or of, you know, the privilege in that you're describing. Do you see that? Because when you being a leader in an organization, you get lots of doing strokes. And what we were talking about is how do we provide space for male identified people to have being strokes, that it's okay to be however I am, be that, you know, whatever, and to follow whatever my dreams and my purpose is, right? So there's that piece too. So and as Felipe said, I can't get enough doing strokes to replace the lack of being strokes.
Could you say a little more about nonverbal strokes, the physical strokes? I'm not sure if you got there, but I'd love to hear more.
Thank you for asking that, yeah. Nonverbal strokes is whether if you're talking and I'm frowning versus if you're talking and I'm smiling, or if you're talking and I'm listening, or if you're talking and I'm looking the other way. Nonverbal, y'all are giving me a lot of nonverbal strokes because when I look there, you're looking at me. That's a nonverbal stroke. If I were to look out there and you were looking down or up or whatever, that'd be a nonverbal way of telling me something. It's how you say it and how you behave rather than what you say. That's the importance of nonverbal strokes. Thank you. Well, physical strokes are hugs. Negative physical strokes are slaps or hitting somebody, or pinching or pushing or shoving or not making room. The physical negative strokes. Positive physical strokes are hugging, touching, massaging, hugging, sexual. There's a lot of strokes in sex. That's how come we like it.
Would withholding touch also be a negative physical stroke?
Withholding strokes is a stroke in that we are punishing, and that is a way of punishing somebody by withholding is a negative stroke, sure. It's a nonverbal negative stroke.
A lot of strokes for positive doing do not translate into positive being.
Right.
Yet, a lot of negative doing can translate into negative, that you can feel then as a negative being.
Doing and behavior strokes reinforce negative being strokes. They reinforce it.